There is a letter that William James wrote to his friend Tom Ward in 1869, when he was 27 years old, that reads like a transcript of a mind consuming itself. He wrote, "Genius, like life, seems to be a matter of luck entirely. Our philosophy is like a vision seen in a dream. When we try to grasp it, it vanishes." He had just returned from Germany, where he had gone to study physiology with some of the great scientists of the age, and he had come back more shattered than when he left. He was supposed to be becoming a physician, possibly a scientist. Instead, he was lying in the spare room of his parents' house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, unable to work, unable to sleep properly, unable to imagine a future that felt worth inhabiting. He had back pain that seemed to have no physical cause. He had eye problems that prevented him from reading for more than short periods. He had what he would later describe as a crisis of will, not the absence of desire but the absence of any belief that his desires could move the world. The crisis had an intellectual structure. James had immersed himself in the science and philosophy of his era, and both were telling him the same thing: the physical world is a closed causal system. Every event, including every event in the human brain, is the necessary consequence of prior events. Consciousness, thought, feeling, intention, is either identical to brain processes or epiphenomenal, a kind of echo that rides alongside them without influencing anything. In either case, what you call your choices are not really choices. They are the inevitable outputs of a machine whose states were determined before you were born. The feeling of deliberating, of weighing options, of choosing, that feeling is real, but it does not correspond to anything in the causal chain. You are an observer of your own behavior, not its author. For many people, intellectual determinism is just a philosophical position, easily believed in the library and easily forgotten in the kitchen. For James, it was not. He was constitutionally incapable of holding a belief at arm's length. Ideas had consequences in his body. And the consequence of this particular idea, taken seriously and fully inhabited, was a complete inability to act. If nothing he did mattered, if his choices were not really choices, if the person he was becoming was just the inevitable product of prior causes, then what was the point of effort? What was the point of anything? He described the experience as a kind of paralysis, a dimming of the whole world, a sense that he was watching his own life from a great distance through dirty glass. Then, in April 1870, he wrote the diary entry. He had been reading the French philosopher Charles Renouvier, and Renouvier had offered a definition of free will that was precise enough to catch James's attention. The sustaining of a thought because one chooses to when one might have other thoughts. Not the ability to defy physics. Not the ability to act uncaused. Simply the ability to direct attention, to hold an idea in focus rather than letting the mind drift, and to call this act of sustained attention a genuine act of agency. James wrote, "I think that yesterday was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvier's essays and see no reason why his definition of free will, the sustaining of a thought because I choose to when I might have other thoughts, need be the definition of an illusion. At any rate, I will assume for the present, until next year, that it is no illusion. My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." This is one of the most important sentences in the history of American thought. Understand what James was doing. He was not asserting that he had proof of free will. He was not claiming that Renouvier had demolished the determinists. He was doing something more radical. He was choosing to believe in free will as an act of will, and he was betting that this choice, if sustained, would produce a life worth living. He was not waiting for the philosophical debate to be resolved. He was making a wager on himself. The result was not immediate. He did not leap from his bed and stride purposefully into the world. He continued to struggle with depression and physical symptoms for years. But the crisis of paralysis lifted. He was able, once again, to act, to study, to teach, to write, eventually to build the most original body of psychological work in American history. The belief in free will did not solve his philosophical problem, but it solved his existential problem, and he spent the rest of his life trying to understand why. The answer, developed across 3 decades of philosophical work, was that beliefs of a certain kind are constituted by the act of holding them. Free will is not a fact waiting to be discovered. It is, in part, a practice, a way of engaging with your own mental processes that, when consistently applied, produces something that functions as freedom regardless of what is happening at the level of neurons. When you sustain attention on a goal, when you return to a chosen thought rather than following the mind's drift, when you act as if your decisions matter, these are not performances of freedom. They are freedom, as far as human experience is concerned. Modern neuroscience has not resolved the debate James was engaging with, and anyone who tells you a has is oversimplifying. The experiments of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, which seem to show that the brain begins preparing an action before the person consciously decides to perform it, were widely interpreted as proving that free will is illusory. But subsequent research has complicated this picture considerably. The readiness potential Libet measured may not represent the initiation of action but the availability of action, the brain making options ready before the conscious mind selects among them, which is entirely compatible with meaningful agency at a higher level. And recent work on the role of conscious attention in learning, habit formation, and behavior change has confirmed that what you attend to, what you choose to think about and practice, has real effects on what your brain becomes. The philosopher Peter Strawson made an argument that James would have recognized as essentially correct. The question of whether free will exists in some absolute metaphysical sense is less important than the fact that we are constitutively unable to abandon the reactive attitudes, blame, praise, gratitude, resentment, that depend on the assumption of agency. We cannot actually live as determinists. We can only believe in determinism during hours when we are not actually living. The moment we return to life, we are back to attributing agency to ourselves and others, and this attribution is not a delusion but a feature of the form of life that human beings are. What James discovered in that diary entry in 1870 was not just a personal coping strategy. It was a philosophical insight about the relationship between belief and action, about the way that certain commitments create the conditions for their own validation. He decided to take his own experience seriously, to trust that the felt sense of deliberating, choosing, and acting was not a hallucination but a real and causally important aspect of human life. That decision saved him. And the theoretical elaboration of that decision became pragmatism. Subscribe to the Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.